Chosen one, stop for a moment. Before you continue listening to anything else, I want you to understand one thing. The season you are living through right now may not look like preparation. It may look like loss. It may look like rejection. It may look like unanswered prayers. It may look like people disappearing from your life without explanation. It may look like doors closing one after another. And perhaps the most painful part is this. You may have started asking yourself, why am I alone? Why did everyone suddenly change? Why don't I feel connected to the people I used to love? Why does it feel like my life has become quieter while everyone else seems to be moving forward? But what if the silence around you is not evidence that you have been forgotten? What if it is evidence that something inside you is being rebuilt? What if the people you thought you needed were never meant to accompany you into your next chapter? And what if this strange season of isolation is not the end of your story, but the beginning of your calling? Stay with me, because there is a reason this message found you at this particular moment. You may not understand it yet, but by the end of this message, you may look at your isolation completely differently. Because sometimes God does not prepare a person by giving them more. Sometimes He prepares them by removing what no longer belongs, and that process can hurt deeply. There are moments when God allows your environment to become quiet, because the noise around you has become louder than the voice within you. You are constantly listening to everyone else's opinions, everyone else's expectations, everyone else's definition of success, everyone else's version of who you were supposed to become, and slowly, without realizing it, you began living a life that looked acceptable to everyone else, while feeling completely unfamiliar to your own soul. Then suddenly, people started leaving. Conversations became shorter. Certain friendships stopped feeling natural. Some relationships became uncomfortable. Places that once felt like home began feeling strange, and you couldn't explain why. You may have even blamed yourself. You wondered if something was wrong with you. Maybe you thought you had become too distant, too emotional, too serious, too different. Maybe you asked yourself why you couldn't simply go back to the way things were. But chosen one, sometimes you cannot. Return to an old version of yourself because that version has already expired. There are seasons of life where God begins separating you from an identity that can no longer carry your future. And when that happens, isolation can feel like punishment. But it may actually be protection. Think about it. If you are standing at the beginning of a completely different chapter, you cannot carry every old attachment into it. You cannot carry every opinion, every insecurity, every unhealthy connection, every distraction, every fear, every version of yourself that was created simply to survive. Something has to change. And sometimes the first thing that changes is your environment. The room becomes quieter, the phone becomes quieter, the invitations become fewer, the conversations become deeper or disappear completely, and suddenly, you are left with yourself. That is where many people become afraid, because silence forces you to hear thoughts you were previously too busy to notice. Silence reveals wounds. Silence reveals desires. Silence reveals fears. Silence reveals what you actually believe. And most importantly, silence reveals what remains when everything else is removed. That is why your current season may feel uncomfortable. You are discovering yourself without the crowd, without applause, without constant validation, without people telling you who you should be. And perhaps that is exactly what you needed. Because your calling cannot always be discovered in noise. Sometimes it is discovered in stillness. Sometimes the greatest revelation comes after the distractions disappear. Sometimes you don't discover what you were born to do until you stop trying to become what everyone else expects you to be. Let that sink in. You may have spent years asking, God, why haven't you changed my situation? While the deeper question was, actually, God, what are you changing inside me? Those are two completely different questions. And perhaps you have been waiting for your circumstances to change, while something much deeper has been happening within you. Your patience has been developing, your discernment has been sharpening, your priorities have been changing, your tolerance for fake connections has been decreasing. Your desire for meaning has been increasing. Things that once impressed you no longer impress you. Conversations that once entertained you now feel empty. And the life you once thought you wanted may no longer satisfy you. That transformation can feel like loneliness. But sometimes it is growth. You are not necessarily losing yourself. You may be meeting yourself for the first time. And there is another reason this season can feel so painful. Because when people leave, they don't just take their presence, they take memories. They take routines, they take expectations, they take the future you imagined with them, and suddenly you are grieving something that may never have been officially yours to keep. That is a strange kind of grief. Nobody sees it, nobody understands it. You smile, you continue your day, you answer messages, you work, you eat, you sleep. But somewhere inside you, you are asking, why did everything have to change? Chosen one. Maybe because you are changing. And when you change internally, eventually your external world begins responding to that change. Not everyone will understand the person you are becoming. Not everyone will recognize your new priorities. Not everyone will celebrate your boundaries. Not everyone will understand why you are no longer available for the same chaos. And that is okay. You were never called to remain understandable to everyone. You were called to become who you were created to become. That distinction matters because your purpose is not determined by how many people approve of you. Your calling is not measured by how crowded your life is. And your worth is not determined by how many people stay. Sometimes one of the most powerful seasons of your life begins when you stop chasing people who have already decided to walk away. Stop begging for explanations from people who chose silence. Stop trying to convince people to see your value. Stop trying to force doors that continue closing. There is a difference between fighting for something meaningful and fighting against reality because you are afraid to let go. Maybe you have been trying to hold on to something that God is trying to release. And perhaps the reason you feel exhausted is because you are pulling in the opposite direction. You want them to stay, but life is teaching you how to move forward. You want the old chapter back, but something inside you knows that you have outgrown it. You want certainty, but this season is asking for faith, and faith is not always knowing what comes next. Sometimes faith is continuing when you cannot see the entire road. That is where your story becomes powerful, because right now you may not see the calling. You may only see the isolation. You may not see the destination. You may only see the separation. You may not see the purpose. You may only feel the pain. But the absence of visible results does not automatically mean the absence of progress. A seed looks buried before it looks alive. And perhaps you have mistaken your burial for your ending, but some things have to be buried before they can grow. Some identities have to die. Some attachments have to end. Some expectations have to disappear. Some versions of you have to be left behind. Not because you are being punished, but because you are being prepared. And I want you to remember something as we continue. You do not have to understand the entire process tonight. You only need to recognize that your current chapter is not necessarily the final chapter. The silence is not necessarily permanent. The loneliness is not necessarily your destiny. The closed door is not necessarily rejection. And the people who left are not necessarily proof that you were unworthy. Sometimes their departure simply creates the space you need to hear what you could not hear before. So if you are in a season where your circle is smaller, do not immediately assume your life is getting smaller. Maybe your life is becoming more focused. If your invitations are fewer, maybe your priorities are becoming clearer. If you spend more, Time alone. Maybe you are finally learning how to listen to yourself. And if certain people no longer understand you, perhaps you are becoming someone they were never prepared to understand. There is more to this, because isolation is only the first layer. The deeper question is, what is God preparing you for? And that is where we are going next. Because once the distractions disappear, something begins to emerge. A desire, a burden, a vision, a gift, a calling, something you cannot explain, something that keeps returning to your mind, something you feel drawn toward even when nobody else understands it. And perhaps you've been feeling it already. You just haven't known what to call it. Stay with me, because in the next part, we are going deeper into that hidden signal, the thing that may be trying to reveal why this season of isolation entered your life in the first place. Part 2, when the noise disappears. Chosen one. There is something that happens when you spend enough time alone. At first you fight it, then you question it, then you become uncomfortable with it. But eventually, if you stop running from the silence, you begin hearing things you could never hear before. Not necessarily an audible voice. Sometimes it is a persistent inner conviction, a recurring idea, a burden you cannot shake, a desire that refuses to disappear, a dream that keeps returning, a question that keeps following you. What am I actually here to do? Maybe that is why certain people cannot recognize you anymore. You are no longer asking the same questions. You are no longer chasing the same things. You are no longer impressed by the same lifestyles. You are becoming selective with your energy, selective with your attention, selective with your relationships. And some people will interpret that as arrogance. Let them. You do not have to explain every boundary. You do not have to defend every change. You do not have to convince everyone that your transformation is real. Keep growing, because eventually your life will explain what your words could never explain. And this brings us to one of the most important lessons of your isolation. Not everyone who leaves is a loss. Read that again in your spirit. Not everyone who leaves is a loss. Some departures create room. Some endings create clarity. Some disappointments reveal character. Some betrayals expose what you were unwilling to see. Some closed doors protect you from entering rooms where you would have lost yourself. And sometimes, greatest blessing is not receiving what you wanted. It is being prevented from receiving what would have destroyed your future. You may not know which disappointment protected you. You may not know which rejection redirected you. You may not know which relationship ending saved you from years of confusion. You may not know which opportunity disappearing created space for something better. That is why you cannot judge your entire story by one painful chapter. You need distance. You need perspective. And sometimes perspective only arrives later. Think about something that once devastated you. Something you cried over, something you begged to keep, something you couldn't understand. Maybe today you can see that losing it changed you. Maybe today you can see that you became stronger. Maybe today you can see that your priorities shifted. Maybe today you realize that what you thought was the end was actually the beginning of a completely different life. And there may be another moment like that ahead. That is why you must be careful about calling your current season a failure. You do not know the full story yet. You are judging a chapter while still inside the book, and that is almost impossible to do accurately. So breathe. Give yourself permission to not know everything. You are allowed to be in transition. You are allowed to be rebuilding. You are allowed to be uncertain. You are allowed to have days where your faith feels stronger and days where you have more questions than answers. The goal is not perfection. The goal is direction. And if your direction is becoming clearer, then you are moving, even if your circumstances have not caught up yet. But there is one final transformation that happens when preparation reaches a certain point. You begin to notice that the person who entered isolation is not the same person who is coming out of it. Your standards change, your priorities change, your confidence changes, your relationship with yourself changes, and most importantly, your understanding of your purpose changes. You stop asking, "How do I get everyone back?" And you start asking, "What am I supposed to build now?" That is the shift. That is where isolation stops being merely something you endure and becomes something you learn from. But there is still a deeper layer. Because your calling is not simply about what you will do. It is about who you must become to carry it. And that is what we are going to uncover next. Part 3. The person you are becoming, chosen. 1. There comes a point in every transformation where you realize something uncomfortable. You don't just need a new opportunity, you need a new version of yourself, because the life you are praying for may require a version of you that your old environment never allowed you to become. Think about that. You may be asking for a bigger platform, but first you need stronger confidence. You may be asking for meaningful relationships, but first you need stronger boundaries. You may be asking for influence, but first you need emotional maturity. You may be asking for purpose, but first you need discipline. You may be asking for a new chapter, but first you need the courage to close the old one. And perhaps that is why your life has become quieter. The quiet is giving you room to become. There are lessons that cannot be learned while you are constantly distracted. There are decisions you cannot make while everyone else is speaking over your intuition. There are dreams you cannot hear while you are consumed with maintaining an identity that no longer fits. So maybe this season is not asking you to chase, maybe it is asking you to prepare. Prepare your mind, prepare your habits, prepare your character, prepare your faith, prepare your emotional strength, prepare your ability to say no, prepare your ability to walk away. Prepare your ability to keep going, because your future calling will not only require inspiration, it will require endurance. And endurance is often built in places where nobody is watching. You become strong privately before you become visible publicly. That is one of life's most uncomfortable truths. People often want the public breakthrough without the private preparation. They want the testimony without the testing. They want the platform without the discipline. They want the harvest without the season underground. But real growth does not work like that. Before a tree becomes visible above the ground, roots are developing beneath it. Nobody applauds the roots. Nobody posts pictures of the roots. Nobody celebrates the roots. But without the roots, the tree cannot survive the storm. And maybe your current season is building roots. That is why you may feel unseen. That is why you may feel unnoticed. That is why you may wonder, why isn't anything happening? Something may be happening. It just may not be visible yet. And this is where many people give up. They mistake invisibility for inactivity. They think because nobody recognizes their growth isn't real. But you don't need an audience to become stronger. You don't need applause to become wiser. You don't need recognition to become disciplined. You don't need everyone to believe in you before you begin believing in yourself. There will be seasons where the only evidence you have is internal. You simply know, I cannot go back. You know that the old lifestyle no longer satisfies you. You know certain conversations no longer belong in your life. You know you are being pulled towards something deeper. You may not have the full blueprint, but you have the next step. And sometimes that is enough. You don't need to know the entire staircase. You need enough courage to take the next step, then another, then another. Eventually you look back and realize you have traveled farther than you thought. That is how calling often unfolds. Not as one dramatic announcement, but as a sequence of small obediences. One decision, one boundary, one habit, one opportunity, one conversation, one act of courage, one moment where you finally say, no, I will not betray myself just to keep someone comfortable. That is growth. And there is something else I want you to understand. Your isolation may have taught you who you are when nobody is watching. That matters, because if you only know how to be yourself when people approve of you, you don't yet fully know yourself. But when you can stand alone and still maintain your values, when you can walk away without needing revenge, when you can forgive without reopening the door, when you can love people without abandoning yourself, you become stronger. You become harder to manipulate. You become harder to distract. You become harder to pull backward. And perhaps that is the person your next chapter requires. Not a perfect person, a prepared person, a person who has learned, a person who has been humbled, a person who has become discerning, a person who understands that not every opportunity is an assignment, not every relationship is permanent, not every closed door is a tragedy, not every delay is denial, and not every lonely season is punishment. Sometimes you are being positioned. That word matters. Positioned. You may not be where you want to be yet, but you may be exactly where you need to be to develop what comes next. Your current environment may be teaching you patience. Your current silence may be teaching you discernment. Your current challenges may be teaching you resilience. Your current lack of recognition may be teaching you to work without applause. Your current isolation may be teaching you to stop outsourcing your identity to other people. And one day, you may understand why. One day you may meet the people who benefit from the person you became during this season. One day, you may step into the opportunity that required the skills you were developing in private. One day you may realize that the door you desperately wanted was actually too small for the life you were being prepared to live. That is why you cannot constantly compare your timeline to someone else's. Their chapter is not your chapter. Their assignment is not your assignment. Their path is not your path, and their speed is not your measure. Your journey may be slower because you are building something deeper. Your preparation may be longer because your responsibility will be greater. Your season may be quieter because your foundation needs to become stronger. Do not despise the quiet. Use it. Study,